one of the interesting kind of things that was also highlighted in that research, a number of different consent experiences were tested. And the only one which resulted in negative feelings from the consumers was actually the experience that we see most often of a pop-up saying that we use cookies in order to do X, Y, Z, please acknowledge, or that this is okay. I would say, just anecdotally, from my surfing of the web, that's probably the case on 80% of websites. So there's a massive opportunity here for organizations that really think through this and begin to take action on a lot of this information really immediately. So I think that's something that's a huge takeaway here today. Now, as you begin to do that, build that trust with your consumers, get more consent, collect more of that first-party data, that's where you have to start. But once you have that information, it's necessary to really drill down, pull out insights, gather more information about those users, have a more intimate understanding of your consumers in order to then start to design and execute strategies. And one of the most popular platforms used for really understanding and starting to mine those consumer insights is Google Analytics 4. So in this next session, I'd like to introduce one of my colleagues, Nidhal Firoze, who is a strategist and team lead at InfoTrust. And fun fact, was also a finalist for the Digital Analytics Association Consultant of the Year in 2022. So Nidhal, I will turn it over to you to give us some knowledge on GA4.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Firstly, thanks to Adam and Lucas for setting the stage and talking about the higher level industry and where digital analytics is shaping up, right? I believe my session will be very well connected to a lot of the points that Adam brought up, because I'll be going into the details and how you would implement some of those recommendations with Google Analytics 4. Firstly, thank you all for coming over. Some of you might have taken flights, buses, trains. I see some familiar faces. I see some faces I have not met before, so I look forward to also interact with you at the end of the session. But for me personally, the Durability Summit is also about staying durable, enduring this weather, because I live in the desert in Dubai, so I'm not used to this. So I shed 3 to 4 layers of clothing to look presentable. But without further ado, let's talk about privacy-focused measurement with Google Analytics 4. So I've got a lot of stats here. I will not talk through these like one by one and spend a lot of time on it, but these are really interesting stats, right? We had a few stats presented by Adam as well. Looking at some of these, we have 84% of consumers. They say that they want more control over how their data is being used. Everyone feels like they're not in control of the data, especially because there are a lot of digital touch points throughout the ecosystem where their data gets collected and gets processed in a lot of ways that's not transparently shared. 33% of users have broken up with companies because they have not been very responsible with how their data was shared. We have had users leave social media companies, retailers, banks, and different types of engagements with organizations because they've not been very trustworthy, according to customers. 44% of the information that gets leaked could have personal information, such as names, email addresses, even passwords. A couple of weeks back, we had a huge breach in a password manager company, right? Which might be very familiar to a lot of you. You might have been using it. I mean, what's the point of having passwords saved in one place if that place gets breached, right? It's all in one place. A lot of us are also moving away to different other password managers considering these type of breaches. 71% of Gen Z users believe that they can avoid or they can escape from a phishing attack, though only 44% of them know what they're talking about. Some of them don't even know what phishing is. For 88% of users, their willingness to share personal data is completely dependent on the trust that they can build with an organization. And that's also foundational to what Adam talked about. Building trust at the center of all your interactions, engagements with a consumer is central and very critical in today's world. So we had a session about how the industry is changing. I will not be talking a lot about the different regulations or the landscape that is changing, but in order to respond to those changes, these are ways in which organizations are approaching or applying different strategies, right? One of the first ones is privacy-centric strategy. So a lot of organizations are trying to build privacy at its core. We also have a book. You might have received it in your swag bags. Privacy-centric marketing, written by Michael, who's in this room as well as Lucas and a few others, which talks about the privacy centricity and how you can ingrain that into the center of your organization's strategy. You need to be more purposeful about what you are going to achieve by collecting data, and you need to also be more transparent about how that data is being collected, how it's being used. Secondly, there's a lot of opportunity to bring in data governance. Now, there are two sides to this, right? Data governance means you cannot let everyone have access to all data. You need to have certain restrictions, right? But on the other side, there's also data democratization, which means you need to enable everyone to have access to data. So both are two sides of the same coin, but it's a bit tricky. You need to make sure while you're enabling everyone to have access to data at the fingertips for self-service analytics, you need to also be cautious about not sharing the wrong data with people that should not be having access, right? 53% of companies have more than 1,000 sensitive files open to every employee, right? Which is a scary statistic. Lastly, you need to also think about building a first-party data architecture. I have my colleague here, Tyler, who will also be speaking about server-side technologies, how you can move towards a more first-party data-oriented architecture. Google also announced the deprecation of third-party cookies in Chrome browsers within the second half of 2024. Thanks for bringing the cookies, Brad, but we need to also get used to not having cookies in our world. Moving further, let's talk about the ways in which Google is innovating analytics. So if you have worked with Google Analytics 4, if you have interacted with it, if you have looked at some of the features that are getting released every other week, month, you can see that there are three pillars around which everything is structured. Firstly, the data collection itself can be in a first-party oriented way, giving more importance to user consent. It also has a more flexible data model, which is a user plus event-based data model, which we'll be talking about more. Secondly, you have the ability to derive powerful insights with built-in machine learning capabilities. So we'll also be talking about some of the machine learning applications within Google Analytics 4. And lastly, the last mile, which is taking action based on that data, and data activation itself is also another area where there are a lot of integration possibilities. You need to also consider that with a lot of privacy regulations that are coming up, you're really limited in terms of how much you can achieve within the analytics tool itself. You need to start leveraging the integrations and start thinking about taking your data into other platforms, and also trying to mix and couple the media data as well as the analytics data in order to be able to drive very useful use cases and to be able to activate that data. So here's a quick snapshot of the user plus event-based data model. Every interaction is now an event in GA4, including a page view, including a session start. And you can have a mix of user properties as well as event parameters. User properties are something that describe a user, which may not change very constantly, right? So me as a user, most likely I'll always be using a same maybe same logging in from a certain location or using a browser, it's subject to change, but it probably does not change within the same session a lot of times. So those parameters that describe a user could be user properties, and then the parameters that describe the actual interactions that somebody performed, those would be your event parameters. It's very flexible in a way that you could reuse the same event parameter across different events just to describe the actions that somebody did on your website. Now, if there's one thought that I'd like all of you to take away from this presentation, it would be being able to do more with less. So let's dive deeper into that. The concept of data minimization is what I would like to focus on. This is a principle which states that anyone who's trying to collect data should be very purposeful about what they're trying to collect. Whatever they are collecting should be directly relevant, and it should have an end objective in mind. I work with different organizations. There have been plenty of times where we have received support requests to collect all the data that you can from a web page, right? Be it all the clicks, all the buttons. Are you being really purposeful about what you want to measure, right? Do you want to put all of that effort in and start just enabling that data stream which collects a lot of data, but not having an end objective of what question are you actually trying to answer with collecting that data, right? So the process or the approach of data minimization is that collect only what is needed, right? In the event of maybe a data deletion request, or if you need to clean up the data, right? At a later point, you wouldn't have to worry about if you have set up like 100 event parameters, you wouldn't need all of those, right? So be very, very clear about what you want to measure. So I've got a quick example which might be relevant to probably everyone in this room. When you signed up for the Durability Summit, all we asked you for was the first name, last name, and email address. We could have asked for a lot more information, but do we need it? Not exactly, right? This is just an example, right? This is an area where user input is gathered voluntarily, where you're inputting it yourself. But in the case of web analytics, there's a lot of things when you're browsing on the website, it's getting collected automatically about you, right? Not about you, but about the interactions that you're performing. Now, if you're not purposeful about which interactions are getting measured, you're just going to have like a lot of data to process. And what would you do with it at the end of the day, right? If you're not super purposeful about what you want to collect. Here are a few benefits of data minimization. To summarize, we have the need to focus on efforts that are very critical and valuable, and hence not every interaction needs to be captured. The implementation will be easier, and not just the implementation. Later on, when you need to maintain that, it will be much easier for you to clean up. You have a lot of flexibility, especially with the changing customer requirements or the regulatory requirements. And eventually, you'll also have consistent data for activation and reporting. So I'd like to present some recommendations to you from a data minimization perspective of how you can apply it across Google Analytics 4 in the different avenues. So we've got data usage, data collection, data storage, and data deletion. And these are areas where you can apply some of these recommendations. Firstly, let's look at data collection. When you enable something known as Google Signals for consumers that have opted into ads personalization, you will be able to identify the consumer across devices, right? That's one feature. And secondly, location and device data collection also has toggles. So what we're going to talk about is the way you can be very granular or very selective about people in which regions do you want to have this data collected for, right? So it gives you geographical granularity. This is actually a screenshot from the interface where you could pick and choose which countries across which countries you want to collect the cross-device, cross-location insights. And the same applies for Google Signals as well. So we talked about collecting the data of users cross-device. Now, we also talked about cookies, cookie notices. We have to be very transparent, right? Now, setting up a cookie notice, it's very simple, right? What do you all think of this cookie notice? Does it look good? Does it serve the purpose? Probably not at all, right? So it's not that simple always, right? There cannot be a one cookie notice that fits all purposes. You need to have a customized cookie notice depending on how you're collecting data, because every company does it differently, right? Here's one example that I want to call out, which specifically mentions stuff like usage of precise geolocation data, or scanning the device characteristics or identification. So it's being very specific about what are some of the items that are being collected. Now let's look at another aspect of data collection, which is consent mode, which my colleague Lucas will also be walking you through in a future session. But consent mode is a feature which enables Google Analytics measurement to respect the consent status of the end user. At the same time, for those who have denied the cookies, you are able to use modeling capabilities within Google to extrapolate the conversion modeling and calculate that conversion, right, without compromising the identity of the user itself. We have seen across consent mode pilots that there has been significant increase in consistent observable traffic, and it also respects e-privacy directives in terms of setting and accessing the cookie. One other call out about GA4 is that the IP address anonymization is a default feature. If you have worked with Universal Analytics, you would probably have to have set up within your tag manager tags an IP anonymized flag and enable that as true, but that is no longer required as an additional configuration. It happens out of the box. So if an IP address of a user gets collected, it is used for inferring the user's location, capturing that data, and then it gets discarded so that it doesn't get stored or logged within Google servers. Strictly no PII, right? Google policies clearly state that you should not be sending any personally identifiable information into Google systems. So what are ways in which you could make sure it doesn't go through a slip in the crack? One way to do it would be to avoid embedding email addresses. So for example, if a call to action button within an email is, if somebody's clicking on that, if it's capturing the person's email address within the URL, that's not a good way to go about it, because the URL is one of the default parameters that gets captured within GA. Secondly, you could also use custom JavaScript. At InfoTrust, we do have different custom JavaScript serving different purposes, especially also for PII, how to make sure that names, email addresses, or other personally identifiable information does not get through into different variables. Lastly, if you are using features like user ID or data import, you need to be double sure that you're not accidentally sending in personally identifiable information via any of those. So these are a few areas where you can be cautious about not accidentally sending PII, because once you have realized that you're actually sending it, you might have to clean it up later, which is doable, but you don't want to be there, right? Data retention. One of the concepts within data minimization was also about being purposeful about collecting someone's data while also keeping it for a minimal period. You do not want to have, keep access to that data for a longer time. Our recommendation is to set it for 26 months, which would give you sufficient time to also do year-over-year analysis, so that you're not prolonging. There's a maximum option of setting the data retention up to 50 months, but you wouldn't really need that. Most standard reports in GA would not be applicable for this setting. It's mostly for the Explore reports or the custom reports. But note that it's better to keep it to a minimum as much as you can, while also making sure it's meeting your reporting use cases. Data deletion, like I said, it's possible. However, if you're already applying the principle of data minimization, and if you're avoiding the collection of personally identifiable information, then you wouldn't have to raise a lot of data deletion requests. However, if you eventually have to do it, there are a few options where you can select a set of parameters, you can select a set of maybe user properties, and there are different combinations of those settings where you can request a data deletion, and it can get deleted from the from the GA4 property. Lastly, from a data usage perspective, I'd like to call out the introduction of data thresholding within GA4. So if you're looking at a GA4 report, and if you're seeing that alert symbol right there, the yellow one, note that data thresholding might be applied. And this is basically a feature in order to prevent the identification of a user, because GA is not intended to be used as like an individual consumer analysis tool. It's more of an aggregated insights tool, right? So you do not want to be able to, especially right now when everyone is more focused on privacy and not very sure about like whether to trust an organization with their data or not, you need to make sure that Google has also made sure that there are ways in which you cannot identify a user, especially when you're selecting maybe a small date range which has a limited number of users, so it does not display, it keeps some data away and displays just a filtered set of data, right? So that's data thresholding. You cannot manually adjust that. Also note that when you enable Google Signals, that's one way in which data thresholding gets enabled, especially because Google Signals is identifying users cross-device. So there's also a need to ensure the end user's privacy is not breached. And when you use demographic information within your reports, that's another way in which data thresholding gets enabled. So a couple of ways to get around it would be also like adjusting the date range and things like that. Lastly, I'd like to call out some of the machine learning and AI features within GA4. We do have consent mode, and which also gives you enhanced conversions. These are basically ways in which you can collect more signals about user behavior and then surface that information within the reports. Additionally, you also have predictive audiences which need a certain minimum amount of data to be collected in order to work. You also have natural language search. So you could just use the search bar at the top of GA4 just to search for a report or ask a natural language question. It could give you different types of results, such as a suggestion to which report to refer to, or a support page, or maybe even a KPI card which answers your question. Lastly, we also have data-driven attribution, which is the default attribution model in GA4, which uses plenty of factors, unlike the first touch or last touch attribution model, which only looks at the last or the first interaction points. Data-driven attribution is also leveraging Google's built-in ML and uses a lot of information, such as the different channels that someone interacted with, the type of creative that was used, the placement of that creative, etc. So that's another way in which ML AI application comes into GA4 directly. Last few thoughts before we wind up. A few things to look at if you have not already considered it. If you're part of an organization that is data-driven and relying on data day to day, you might want to consider being privacy-centric if you're not doing that already. You need to also ensure tag governance is in place. There should not be any rogue tags. One thing we always work with clients about is when you're moving away from Universal Analytics to GA4, you do not want to bring in all of your technical debt and all your bad implementations into the new system, right? It's a way to start from scratch and ensure that you're minimizing the data that you're collecting. So that's lesser maintenance. And lastly, we will be talking more about this later, but server-side tagging is another major industry shift. You're able to control, have more governance, and be able to collect first-party data using server-side tagging. So these are just a few thoughts, and that's pretty much it for today. Hope you were able to take home some good recommendations, and yeah, minimize the amount of data that you can collect, and enable the end user to have trust in you as an organization. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we're good. Thank you, Nidhal, very much for those insights, recommendations, and thoughts around GA4 specifically, which I know many people are using. Now, one of the core concepts that Nidhal really focused on there was that concept of being purposeful and being intentful, specifically with respect to the data that's being collected. So clearly identifying, outlining those use cases. But this concept of being purpose-driven and being intentful with your actions, we can really think about it in a little bit more of a macro sense as well, right? Not just with the data that's being collected, but also with the platforms that are being used, the strategies that are being employed. And identifying specific use cases, specific challenges, and then designing those solutions in order to be able to meet those specific items.